Have you ever wondered what happens when the system picks on someone they think can't fight back? This incredible true story will show you exactly what occurs when they choose the wrong person to mess with. Meet Reuben Holt, a quiet African-American farmer from Greene County, Alabama, who found himself facing off against corporate lawyers and a condescending judge. They assumed he'd be easy to intimidate, a simple man without connections or fancy education. What they didn't realize was that Reuben carried something far more powerful than any law degree, a heritage of resilience and a truth that would shake the very foundations of their prejudice. Buckle up, because this story starts as a land dispute but transforms into something that reminded an entire nation what real dignity looks like when it refuses to back down. Picture this: a sweltering Tuesday morning in rural Alabama where even the ceiling fans seemed to labor harder than the lawyers present. The legal matter appeared straightforward on the surface, yet it carried the weight of generations. Greene County officials, pressured by an Atlanta-based agricultural corporation, had initiated eminent domain proceedings against a 92-acre farm. The company's justification? They needed this specific property to construct what they called a sustainable agricultural research center. The farm belonged to Reuben Holt, a 67-year-old man whose weathered hands spoke volumes about decades of honest labor. He entered that courthouse without legal representation, just carrying a manila folder, wearing his well-worn baseball cap, and possessing an unshakable dignity that time couldn't erode. This wasn't just any piece of land to Reuben. He'd been working those fields since his 19th birthday. Before him, his father had tended the same soil, and his grandfather before that. The progression told the story of American dreams realized through backbreaking effort, first as sharecroppers, then as proud property owners after 27 years of saving every possible penny. Those acres had nurtured cotton crops, then peanuts, later collard greens, and most importantly, they'd cultivated pride. Now some corporate executives in expensive suits wanted to strip it all away for their vision of advancement. The judge presiding over this case was Melene Archer, age 49, known for her razor-sharp wit and equally sharp wardrobe. A Yale law graduate, she'd built her reputation on swift decisions and no-nonsense attitudes. Within Montgomery's legal community, she was celebrated as efficient, articulate, and precise. However, here in Greene County, where court sessions still opened with prayer and sometimes concluded with handshakes, she appeared distinctly uncomfortable and made little effort to conceal her disdain. When Reuben's name was called, he rose to his feet. Despite a lifetime of bending over crops and fence posts, his posture remained proudly erect. He wore a sun-faded denim shirt tucked into navy work pants, and his boots bore the telltale red clay that marked every step across the courtroom's polished floor. "Your Honor," Reuben began, his voice carrying the rich, full tones steeped in Alabama's southern dialect. "I might not speak like those folks in their glass towers, but I believe I've earned the right to stand in this room." Judge Archer made no attempt to hide her amusement. Turning slightly toward her court clerk, she remarked loud enough for everyone to hear, "Well, if I shut my eyes, I'd think we were conducting legal proceedings in a tobacco shed." Several spectators shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One man couldn't bring himself to look up. But Reuben remained completely unfazed. He blinked slowly, then reached into his folder and withdrew a single yellow document, carefully preserved in plastic. He approached the bench and placed it there with reverent care. "Before you find that amusing again, ma'am," he said with measured calm, "you might want to examine what your father's teacher wrote back in 1964 before you ever put on that judicial robe." Judge Archer's expression shifted. "Excuse me, what did you just say?" "Go ahead and read it," Reuben replied simply. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Judge Archer reluctantly picked up the document. It contained handwritten text, in careful cursive, properly signed and dated. She adjusted her reading glasses. July 3, 1964. "To whom it may concern, should there ever come a time when the dignity of property owners, regardless of race or background, faces destruction by suits and systems, let this stand as testimony. Land represents more than mere property. It embodies memory, toil, and spirit. No courthouse should ever silence someone who works the earth in good faith. Signed, Judge Emery Lancaster, Greene County Circuit Court. The color completely drained from Archer's face. Judge Lancaster had been a white Republican, unusual for that time period, and had served as a lifelong mentor to her deceased father, who frequently quoted the man's principles during family meals she'd once found tedious. Now those very ideals stood before her, delivered by the hands of a man she'd just ridiculed. Reuben didn't need to raise his voice. That's my grandfather's handwriting. He served as Judge Lancaster's driver during an era when he couldn't enter this courtroom except to sweep the floors. The judge allowed him to observe legal proceedings when nobody else was watching. He wrote that letter the day after my uncle was beaten for attempting to register to vote down in Tuscaloosa. The silence became almost unbearable. A young African-American law student in the back row fought back tears. An elderly white farmer removed his hat and placed it respectfully in his lap. Nobody dared to move. Judge Archer cleared her throat nervously. "Mr. Holt," Reuben gently interrupted her. "Are you saying you've heard enough, Judge, or are you just now realizing who's keeping watch over you?" Her mouth formed a tight line, jaw clenched with tension. The court reporter stared down at her stenography machine, afraid to make even the slightest sound. Then came the moment nobody anticipated. Reuben placed a second document on the bench. "This here's a copy of our property deed signed by Judge Lancaster personally in 1968. He did that for my father after the bank claimed our family name wasn't sufficient to secure financing. He vouched for us directly. Said, 'No man is truly poor if his roots run deep enough to pull a mule.'" Judge Archer stared at the papers, caught between her upbringing and her wounded pride. Reuben didn't press his advantage. He simply stood there, motionless as the oak that provided shade for his front porch each morning. In the back row, someone raised their smartphone and began recording. By the time Judge Archer called for a recess, footage of her mocking Reuben had already found its way to Facebook, first shared by a local minister with the caption, "Black farmer ridiculed for his accent. This is American justice." The next few hours changed everything. The video clip spread like wildfire across social media platforms, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube. News anchors quoted Reuben's powerful words, "You might want to examine what your father's teacher wrote." Something about that quiet moment of strength captured the nation's attention in a profound way. A hashtag emerged. Stand with Reuben. People from Georgia, Mississippi, even as far away as Oregon began posting their own videos, proudly speaking in their regional accents. Farmers, educators, factory workers all declaring, "This is my voice, and it deserves the same respect as anyone else's." That evening found Reuben back on his porch, watching fireflies dance along the edges of his soybean fields when a white pickup truck pulled up near his gate. A young woman emerged, dressed in jeans and a linen blazer. She was Camille Rhodes, a civil rights attorney from Birmingham, carrying a folder instead of a camera. "I'd like to represent you, Mr. Holt, without charge, not for the publicity, but because certain fights matter more than billable hours." Reuben studied her with the look of someone who'd heard similar promises many years before. Then he nodded, once. "All right, Miss Camille, but no fancy speeches, just the truth." She smiled warmly. "That's the only kind worth telling." By the following sunrise, Greene County had transformed from a sleepy Alabama community into national news. Reporters arrived with their equipment, establishing positions on the courthouse lawn with tripods, broadcast vans, and steaming coffee cups. Headlines across the country read, "Southern Farmer Humbles Judge with Historical Document," and "The Voice from the Soil Rises Up." But Reuben Holt had no interest in media attention. He spent that morning repairing a loose barn door hinge and checking on a sick calf. When Camille Rhodes returned with legal documents and her briefcase, he met her at his kitchen table with fresh biscuits already warming in the oven. Camille, sharp-minded but approachable, had dedicated years to defending communities ignored by prestigious firms in glass towers. She worked most effectively in silence, allowing facts to speak for themselves. That morning they examined land records, historical surveys, even old grain delivery receipts that documented Reuben's stewardship of every acre like footprints in fertile soil. "They didn't just underestimate you," Camille said quietly, flipping through the weathered documents. "They never expected you to maintain this kind of detailed record." Reuben sipped his coffee, eyes peaceful. "They assume if it's not stored on a computer, it doesn't exist. But the Earth remembers everything." 2 days later, court reconvened under intense scrutiny. The courtroom overflowed with spectators. Ministers sat alongside veterans, college students next to field workers. Someone in the back had printed Judge Lancaster's 1964 letter and pinned it to their denim jacket like a badge of honor. When Judge Archer entered, she moved rigidly, eyes fixed straight ahead, avoiding all contact. She called the session to order, but the atmosphere had completely transformed. There was no deference, no intimidation, only a sense of evaluation. Not just of Reuben's case, but of what her response would reveal about the entire system. Camille Rhodes stood, crisp and composed. "Your Honor, we request your immediate withdrawal from this case based on prejudicial behavior, public mockery of the plaintiff's identity, and documented historical bias against landowners of color now brought to national attention." Judge Archer attempted to steady her voice. "Ms. Rhodes, this court isn't influenced by social media hysteria." Camille nodded calmly. "Understood. But is it influenced by documented truth?" She presented a comprehensive binder with labeled evidence. The viral video, authenticated copies of the 1964 letter, sworn statements from retired Greene County clerks verifying Judge Lancaster's mentorship of Reuben's grandfather, and testimony from a local historian confirming that Reuben's property was part of a reparations case never filed due to intimidation in 1971. "These aren't merely internet headlines," Camille continued steadily. "These are the historical records upon which your own judicial legacy rests." The gallery sat in hushed tension, thick enough to feel. Archer, once unshakable, hesitated, her fingers trembling as she opened the binder. She looked up slowly, scanning the packed courtroom. Then, in a voice stripped of all arrogance, she announced, "This court will recess until noon. I will return with a decision on the recusal motion." As she left the bench, murmurs rippled through the crowd. Reuben remained silent, his gaze not on her, but on the floor beneath his boots, the same boots he'd worn to his father's funeral, the same ones he wore during his first harvest. Outside the courthouse, the steps buzzed with reactions. A group of young tradesmen spoke with a documentary crew about what Reuben's stand meant to their community. "He's not just protecting land," one explained. "He's protecting respect itself." On the corner, a retired pastor was overheard saying, "Lord, we've waited decades for a voice like his." At noon, the gavel echoed sharply. Judge Archer returned, her face pale but composed. "In the interest of maintaining public confidence in this institution, and upon reflection of my previous remarks, I hereby withdraw myself from these proceedings." No applause, no cheers, just profound stillness. Camille whispered, "That's accountability, not victory." Federal Judge Franklin Carver from Mobile was assigned to the case, known for his balanced approach and respect for constitutional property rights. He arrived the next day without fanfare, soft-spoken and dignified. His first action was to reschedule the hearing, giving both sides 3 days to submit evidence for his review. Camille and Reuben worked late into each evening, organizing decades of documentation. She marveled at his detailed recall. Reuben remembered specific dates, crop varieties, flood years, and harvest yields with remarkable precision. "I don't trust computers when my memory's sharper than a plow blade," he told her. When asked why, he'd never filed for water rights or other legal protections. He simply shrugged. "Didn't know I needed to. I thought being honest was sufficient." Meanwhile, external forces began mobilizing. The Agricultural Corporation sent a new attorney, Warren Price, a silver-haired litigator from Atlanta, who arrived in a tailored charcoal suit and spoke in carefully calculated tones. He dismissed Camille's approach as emotional advocacy and stated in a press release, "Progress sometimes demands temporary discomfort." The backlash was immediate. Local farming unions issued statements supporting Rubin, a coalition of retired civil rights attorneys filed an amicus brief, citing systematic abuse of eminent domain powers in historically black counties. News outlets ran side-by-side comparisons. Rubin in work clothes, Price in Italian leather, Camille in practical boots, Price in designer wingtips. This case, one news anchor observed, is no longer about farmland. It's about whose history gets bulldozed in the name of innovation. By the time the new hearing began, Greene County had become the center of national conversation. Schools paused to discuss the case. Students wrote essays titled, "My Grandfather's Hands Matter Too." A quilt shop owner in Montgomery stitched a banner with Rubin's words, "The land remembers." Through it all, Rubin said little. He repaired his tractor belt, visited his wife's grave with fresh gardenias, and rose each day to tend soil that had never once failed him. He didn't seek praise or headlines. He sought fairness. In court, Judge Carver listened more than he spoke. When proceedings opened, Camille presented historical land records, including the 1968 deed signed by Judge Lancaster, water usage maps showing generational crop patterns, and a notarized statement from a neighbor confirming Rubin's property. Boundaries hadn't shifted in 4 decades. The real bombshell came when a former employee of the agricultural company stepped forward. Darius Cole, a surveyor who had quietly resigned months earlier, submitted internal emails showing executives had planned to redraw survey maps, falsify soil quality reports, and cite future tax incentives if Rubin's land could be reclassified as abandoned. When asked why he came forward now, Darius looked directly at the judge. "Because I watched that man speak truth and I realized I'd been silent for too long," the courtroom murmured, then fell silent again. Camille rested her hands on the table calmly. She didn't smile or react dramatically. She simply breathed steadily, just as Rubin had throughout this entire ordeal. The company's attorney objected, attempted delays, even accused Camille of grandstanding, but Judge Carver leaned forward with furrowed brows. "This is a court of legal record, not a venue for rehearsed outrage." Continue. By day's end, Camille had constructed a case about more than property, about legacy, demonstrating the hidden cost of severing families from their history one parcel at a time. When Rubin's turn came to speak again, he said simply, "I come from men who never owned much, but they kept their word. I'd rather sleep in a shed than break mine." The gallery rose as court adjourned, not because proceedings had ended, but because something sacred had finally been spoken aloud, not in anger, but with a clarity too powerful to ignore. Outside, Rubin walked past a group of students from Tuskegee University. One reached out and shook his hand. "Sir, I didn't realize history could feel so alive." Rubin looked at him gently. "It always was. People just forget where to listen." The final hearing opened under a sky heavy with summer storm clouds. The courtroom, filled once more, not with protest noise, but with reverential quiet. People had driven from as far as Jackson and Memphis, queuing outside hours before doors opened. The town square had become something between a rally and a family reunion. Rubin arrived in the same 20-year-old truck, wearing the same shirt from his father's funeral. His expression remained calm, not triumphant. For him, this was never about winning. It was about being heard. Judge Carver entered without ceremony, arranged his files, and began immediately. The company's attorney offered a final argument, attempting to frame the seizure as part of regional economic revitalization and asserting that Mr. Holt's personal attachment to the property, while admirable, cannot obstruct the arc of agricultural progress. Camille didn't flinch. She approached the bench slowly and placed her final exhibit before the judge. A satellite image showing crop rotation over decades, overlaid with Rubin's handwritten planting logs, and a notarized letter from the USDA verifying the land was actively producing yields above regional averages. If this land is abandoned, Camille said, her voice steady, "then so is every acre in this country touched by calloused hands." Judge Carver nodded once, then leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "Does the prosecution have any documented public vote, legislative order, or signed release indicating Mr. Holt surrendered any rights to this property?" The attorney hesitated, papers rustling in his trembling hands. "No, Your Honor." Carver leaned back. "Then on what legal grounds was eminent domain initiated?" There was no response. There didn't need to be. The silence spoke volumes. Camille sat beside Reuben, and the room remained perfectly still. Then the judge spoke, slow and firm. "This court recognizes Mr. Holt's unbroken legal claim to his 92 acres. All eminent domain proceedings are hereby nullified. Furthermore, this court recommends an investigation into potential misconduct regarding property appraisals and survey alterations submitted by the defendant. Case dismissed." Reuben did not smile. He did not weep. He simply stood and nodded once, the same gesture he made after every successful harvest. The courtroom rose, not in applause but in recognition. Even the opposing attorney stood, if only because dignity demanded it. As Reuben walked into the Alabama air, a light drizzle began. It didn't feel like rain. It felt like cleansing. On the courthouse steps, someone handed Reuben a hand-sewn banner reading, "My Roots, My Rights." A local pastor placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "You didn't just keep your land, son. You reminded us why we fight for it." Camille stood nearby, her phone buzzing with calls from every major news outlet. Reuben glanced at her. "I'm not appearing on any talk shows." She laughed softly. "Didn't think you would." Instead of interviews, Reuben went home, fed his chickens, walked his property line, and stopped by the oak tree where he and his brother once played stickball. He stood there for a long while, then took out a pocket knife and carved a date into the trunk. July 18th. No explanation needed, just the date. That was sufficient. The days that followed unfolded like aftershocks. News spread nationwide. College law classes analyzed the case as a turning point in modern property rights. A Birmingham school district launched a curriculum module titled Legacy and Land. In North Carolina, a group of black farmers started a podcast called The Dirt Speaks, inspired by Reuben's testimony. A major newspaper ran an editorial titled The Accent of Justice, stating that the drawl of the South now echoes like scripture in courtrooms that once silenced it. Reuben, meanwhile, declined every interview, refused every invitation, and simply said, "Let people talk. I've got fences to mend." Camille received over 400 requests for legal assistance within 2 weeks. Mostly small landowners, many black or Hispanic, all tired of feeling unheard. Her practice expanded. She trained interns to listen before speaking and hung a photo of Reuben's fields in her office with a note underneath. Dignity first. At the state level, the ripples continued. Lawmakers proposed legislation called the Holt Provision, aiming to place stricter constraints on eminent domain cases involving ancestral land. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Even more powerful than policy was the story itself. A Mississippi high school senior wrote his college entrance essay about Reuben's trial and was later accepted into Howard University's law program. A veteran in Arkansas mailed Reuben his Purple Heart with a note. "I fought for people like you." A white rancher from Wyoming wrote, "I never thought I'd see the day when a man's voice could shake a courtroom like thunder. Thank you for showing us how to stand tall." Then came the plaque. It wasn't county-sponsored or corporate-funded. It was paid for by small donations from ordinary people, farmers, librarians, teachers, welders, bus drivers, most giving no more than $5 or $10. The plaque was installed quietly on a stone post outside the Greene County Courthouse. It read, "This soil remembers. Reuben Holt, 2024. A voice that refused to be mocked. A legacy that refused to be moved." Beneath that, "Justice doesn't always wear robes. Sometimes it wears dust." Reuben didn't attend the unveiling. He was in his barn patching a roof leak and organizing feed bins. But later that evening, Just after sunset, he drove by in his old truck with headlights dimmed. He didn't get out, just stopped for a moment, looked at the plaque and tipped his hat toward it. That was his way of saying thank you. Weeks turned into months, national headlines faded, but local stories grew stronger. People began appearing at Reuben's gate, not to gawk, but to listen. They brought homemade food, seed packets, handwritten notes. Some just stood quietly by the fence and left. He never turned anyone away, but he didn't speak much either. He didn't need to. The fields, the fence line, the sound of wind across soybean rows, they spoke for him. One afternoon, a university professor brought students to see the land. One of them, a young black woman with glasses and braids, stood gazing across the field and asked softly, "Mr. Holt, do you ever wish you just let it go?" Reuben considered for a moment, then replied, "No, ma'am. Letting go is how people lose themselves. I didn't hold on for pride. I held on because my daddy's hands are still in that dirt. That makes it sacred. You don't walk away from sacred." The students were quiet. One began crying. Another recorded his words, and the clip later went viral, not because it was dramatic, but because it was authentic. That same clip was played at a law conference in Atlanta, a civil rights symposium in Boston, a county commissioner meeting in rural Ohio. It spread not as a trend, but as testimony. 1 year after the verdict, the Alabama Bar Association added a new section to its judicial ethics training, recognizing regional prejudice in legal discourse. The first slide quoted Reuben's courtroom words, "If this land is abandoned, then so is every acre touched by calloused hands." That same year, Reuben received a letter from a third-grade teacher in Kansas. "My students now know that justice sounds like Alabama. Thank you for being their first lesson in what standing up looks like." Attached was a drawing of Reuben standing in a field with sunflowers taller than his hat. He hung it on his refrigerator. In his quiet way, Reuben continued. He planted the next season, repaired the barn roof, hosted a Sunday cookout with sweet tea and gospel music playing softly from an old radio. Life didn't change him. It deepened him. One evening, he stood again by the oak tree where he'd carved that date. This time, he brought a small American flag and tied it gently to a branch, not to claim patriotism, but to mark a moment when the country paused, listened, and remembered. As the sun dipped low and crickets began their evening chorus, Reuben whispered, words no one else heard but the land, "Y'all can laugh again if you want. I'll still be standing." Then he turned, boots brushing softly against the soil, and walked home.